As you know, I have been involved in research around the impact of especially large-scale interventions and mega events is now for over 20 years. So my angle and the platforms and frameworks that I have had the privilege to develop and grow over the years had been mainly motivated by the requests, the demands for assessment of one-off interventions. And it's really interesting to see how much then these kinds of frameworks can be replicable and adaptable to plenty of other environments. I'm still based at the University of Liverpool, but I might also tell you that after 10 years, I have moved on from the Institute of Cultural Capital. So that has been a very important part of my life and of the research that we have done, but also as part of the discussion around long-term, around sustainability and resilience of certain frameworks. It could be a different conversation to see how institutes of research, how long, what is the lifespan for particular models and approaches to research. So just, I thought I would mention it. So you see here some of the events that I have had the opportunity to develop impact frameworks for. And as always, the key niche and the key priority for me has been to look and to develop frameworks that are both holistic but also longitudinal. So with all of these examples, the distinct characteristics of the work with myself and my team has been to look what happens 5 or 10 years later. Now, we don't have the time to compare all of the different frameworks, but the very first one was developed in the context of Glasgow. And it was the work that was done to look into the 10-year legacy of Glasgow as what was then called European City of Culture in 1990. And the work was started in 2001, 2002. So this is very early days for the discussion of what is impact and how we value culture and how we assess it. And this set the foundations for obviously the program of work that is best known, and that I feel very pleased that has been considered as a reference for you all. So this was, of course, the work on Liverpool as European Capital of Culture and the Impacts 08 program that started 3 years before the actual event. So it was an amazing opportunity to test the theories and discussions that I had been discussing in Glasgow in what was called the Cities and Culture Project by the Centre for Cultural Policy Research in the University of Glasgow. Liverpool was the opportunity to push further the ambitions. Now, something very important when we make sense of what was possible with Impacts 08 and how this can still be replicable today. We are talking of a very different point in time. It's maybe like a golden era where there was quite a lot of funding available. This precedes the global financial crisis that started, of course, at the end of 2008, 2009. So it's fascinating to think back, both for the event, but also importantly for the research. And I remember we were complaining at the time, but when I look back, we can see this will never, I cannot imagine a situation enabling such degree of ambition and such degree of support by many, many different stakeholders. So yes, with Liverpool, we could debate for long how we understand budgets, but here you have something, and it's in pounds, 130 million pounds associated to a program. It was not just 1 year, it was 6 years, but it was something that no other European Capital of Culture has done before. The normal budgets tend to be 30, 40 or 50 million euro maximum. Associated with this, what was very interesting and appealing to me as a researcher when I set up the framework was that it really presented clearly the narrative of culture across all domains, linking issues around faith, in the case of Liverpool as a port city, the sea, performance, heritage, etc., etc. So it was very clear and, well, easier than it would have been with other events to argue the case for holistic impact assessments, given that here we had an intervention that was far beyond an art festival. So you have been interrogating this. Briefly, I thought it would be useful for you to hear it from me, no, in terms of how I present the framework. But yes, the main distinctive characteristics was the fact that from the start, the point of this research program was for it to be longitudinal. And this meant doing work before, during, and after the intervention, something that is easier said than done. And it started by being, for the first time, a study that was not retrospective. So it actually started, and we were able to set up baselines 3 years before the intervention, as well as looking back in time. You know, a lot of the work and the data gathering took us back to the year 2000, because this was the time when the city started creating arguments to attract the big cultural interventions. So again, very ambitious, and I'm very pleased to then 10 years on to have had the chance to revisit also the program with the Impacts 18 research. Essential, and I have heard, you know, from the previous presentations, is a very important thing for you to see its merits. It's not just a jargon or a keyword. This idea that we have to analyze process as well as outcome. So it's not just about the impact, it's also about the context to that impact, and obviously then how these results and translate into sustainable legacies. The holistic process, obviously, and very importantly, the collaborative approach. I'm trying to see whether, oops, here we are. So obviously these are the different thematic areas we explored, and the way they interrelated is the subject of much discussion, and there is lots published around that. Now, I'm sure you have been making your assessments of it, but this was the way that the arguments were presented by myself at that time, when it was very pioneering to do this. We are talking of 2005. It was this idea: diversity of areas of impact, process as well as outcome, the longitudinal, the fact that it's about an evidence base for that can cover and address the interest of many different stakeholders, not just the organizers of the specific event we were observing, and the fact that it could help provide intelligence to guide decision making. So one point that might be useful to all of you, but again, it's all about economies of scale, resources and capacity. What made a big difference in order to guarantee the value and the merits of this research program that at 2 different universities, we were not only observing and documenting remotely. I also had one of my team members having the role to act as a broker to provide intelligence and guide decision making, which is a very difficult role to play, because you have to be both the critic and observer, but you also might be influencing and shaping your object of study. So it's very important to understand that actually the fact that this research program existed had an impact on the way the event we were studying was delivered. So when we think more broadly about any heritage interventions, a big point of reflection for the researcher is how involved you want to be and how you negotiate the need to distance yourself with the value of being someone quite implicated that might actually shape or lead to changes in the way planning and deliverables are put together by the people in charge of yes, a heritage intervention or another event. So this was time consuming, but it had a big impact as well in approaches to monitoring and assessment of culture in Liverpool. Right. And of course, the transferable elements. What was important was to see how this could then be adapted for the assessment of other interventions beyond the European Capital of Culture, beyond Liverpool. Now, important, these lists, I'm sure you have seen them in many, many different other contexts, but I always want to insist, we were very ambitious because we had time. So I had a whole year and a half to be able to set up the scene and to do trial and error on areas that were particularly ambitious. How important it was to take very seriously the mapping of the material that existed already. And we say it all the time, but we often do not do it. So it's great the time that you are taking as a platform to set the scene. This has to be the part of the planning on any impact and holistic assessment, is how you digest, how you understand the material that already exists, how you troubleshoot it, and how you store it in a way that allows you to revisit it over time. So we set up those indicators, and there were special reports published to explain and justify our choices. We, of course, worked on secondary data analysis, trying to understand the different reports and materials that existed from all the different bodies and with different agendas. And only then we set up the new projects, no? the new areas that required gathering. And again, ongoing conversation with the different partners. Very time consuming, very frustrating at times. It slows down the process, but it is essential in order to maintain that sense of ownership and buy-in. So again, as part of the budget and the planning is how much time can we allocate for this kind of mediation that is required all the time. And it's one I will tell you in terms of what has been the problem in terms of replicating this research framework after the Liverpool experience. So again, you know about this. If you have been looking into the program, we set up these 25 primary data projects across the different thematic areas. And we, depending on budget availability, and some of the projects were quite large, some were quite niche and quite specific to needs that were unique to Liverpool, but obviously setting up how many points in time we could be gathering data. And in terms of what we have been doing 10 years on, we have selected projects since. Now, this exercise was very valuable in order to then establish the assessment of, in my case, the case and the area that has interested me the most, that is the European Capital of Culture program. It was also adapted in order to assess what is called the Cultural Olympiad, or the cultural program of an Olympic Games, in this case in London in 2012. And again, I have no time to show you the differences, but it was a very interesting experience for us all to see, again, test their replicability. In the case of this program of work for the European Parliament and the report that is associated with it, and you can all download, what was valuable is then to see how this framework in Liverpool could be adapted to the comparison of existing data for over 60 examples of events taking place across Europe. We didn't do any additional primary data analysis, but what we did with this new approach to modeling that could be also useful as a reference was to sit the different areas of impact that we had identified against the different areas of strategic thinking and programming and setting up that explain the structure and the priorities behind an intervention. So yes, we were playing with all of this. And again, it's always useful to think of the visualizations and then to see how easy it is to translate this into very clear-cut evidence lines. Now, the trick here is what is transferable and what is not. And what is apparent, and with the previous presentations and so on, is that there are endless examples of really interesting visualizations of how we get different areas to relate to each other. And none of them is the ultimate perfect model. It's always good to refresh, no, and to rethink why at this point in time we are using this particular framework or another. It's important to have the time to revisit and build on them, but again, we will always have to change them because of the impact of different time and conditions. So when looking at what has happened since we did these studies, obviously one of the main challenges has been the change in the climate and the funding availability. So the kind of final slide that I will have will share with you how difficult it is to be as ambitious as we were with Liverpool when the budgets and the time available to conduct research keep shrinking. And I wanted to show you just one specific example of a project that we conducted in Liverpool itself, so the very same city where the Impact SoAid program had been put to the fore and where it was perceived as incredibly successful, in order to assess the impacts and perceptions around a heritage intervention, in this case, the World Heritage Site award for the city of Liverpool, and the reasons why, despite the fantastic experience of having a European capital of culture and the fantastic team of people working with the culture departments and also the universities conducting research, how is it that this city ended up being in the danger list and putting at risk a major accolade, such as being a World Heritage Site? It felt like a real contradiction that this could be happening in the very same city and so soon. So we, in the context with the Institute of Cultural Capital, and if you have not seen this, I recommend you look at the report. It's not long, but it offers very interesting questions. We were trying to see, okay, to what extent what we have been doing to assess the the 2008 experience could help us understand what is happening in the context of a World Heritage list. I don't have the time to go into the details, but what it emerged were some very interesting subtleties in terms of how heritage was understood by the city. And again, one of the real, always important and interesting exercises, that is how we create a mind map with terminology, how we understand culture, how we understand creativity, how we understand heritage, what associations come to mind. And what we uncovered was that in the case of Liverpool, a city that had suffered extremely due to a loss of industry, a loss of an economic base, there was a real drive and a focus about being innovative and about thinking in the future. So heritage was perceived as potentially a problem or something that could drag down the city and try to make it into a chocolate box. There was a lot of fear. Heritage was a word that was not used comfortably by those people that had been involved with the European Capital of Culture program. And when we applied our research and when we tried to understand economic impacts, we tried to apply the variation of our holistic model in order to understand why the World Heritage Site was being endangered in a city, we uncovered all kinds of contradictory pieces of evidence that put into question as well how you set up methodologies, how do you engage different stakeholders, and how do you share knowledge. So again, this is just another example, another visualization, but an indication of how for every single project that we embark on, there is always a need to rethink what is the framework. So I believe that what you're trying to do with SoPHIA, you are trying to identify obviously a set of core principles, but what is very clear is that it has always to be a bit like a jigsaw. It cannot be something that that can be applied in every single way. So in our case, we had the Impact SoAid research program, and we could see that depending on the project or the initiative that we were going to assess, we would need to use and model priorities in a slightly different way. So again, it's just another example of the kinds of debates that existed on the back of this very contradictory situation, no? With having a city going through a major renaissance, being rediscovered as a cultural hub, but at the same time, a city that would become, from an official point of view, quite dismissive of official heritage accolades because of a fear and some negative associations with the term heritage for a place that wanted to be seen as creative, innovative, and attractive to economic investment. So I will now, it's just the wrap up in terms of the reflections that all of these experience has led on to for me. The key challenges, I mean, despite the fantastic examples that are out there, and I really can tell you, since 2001, we have gone a long way in approaches to evaluation and impact assessment for culture and heritage. There has been so much fantastic work, and certainly not only in the Anglo-Saxon context. I'm always very happy to hear awareness that at times the Anglo-Saxon take can be a bit overpowering. Actually, there are fantastic examples in plenty of other environments, and linguistics and how we use them. However, it has not been a straight line, and it never is, because regardless of the progress, there is always a new type of challenge that emerges. So we need to continue fighting and developing arguments to defend core principles. And sadly, we can never take for granted that a battle has been completely won. So the very basic point about multiple impact approaches, in fact, continues to be not obvious at all. The balance between the economic, the social, the cultural dimension, the environmental, the political, is always really tricky. And I always say, what matters is balance. And it's true that what we have gone through is a dominance of the economic rationale. But if ever we get to a point where we halt this economic rationale, we might also get in trouble if we start emphasizing another rationale instead, you know, if it's only the cultural or the social. What you need is a good balance between all of them. So of course, the economic rationale has become so strong because in the 1960s and the 70s and early 80s, it was very weak and it was dismissed by many in the culture, arts and heritage sector. So as a kind of counterpoint, there were many that started arguing very strongly, we need to understand the economic value of culture. And this was very important to start with. It's just that then it has gone too far, no? So now we need to redress it. What matters is then the time we allocate to triangulate data. And it's time consuming, it's frustrating because we all come with different disciplinary backgrounds, but it's essential. So yes, 10, 15 years on, it's still an argument that needs to be fought for. The longitudinal take, the big challenge is how you get this commitment over a long period of time. Despite having managed to deliver the Impact SoPHIA program, to replicate the exercise 10 years on was really tricky, really difficult. And the agendas had changed. One of the issues is obviously the funding cycles and who do you get the sign off from? No? So of course with universities, it's always good to have a link to institutions that exist in the long run, even if it's great to collaborate with think tanks and consultancies that can be a bit more flexible. But yes, the key is who retains those archives, who protects the data sets, regardless of funding. And in my case, I have my 20-year bag of materials. And now that I have moved on beyond the Institute of Cultural Capital, what I'm doing is, again, reorganizing all of this in what I'm calling the Cities of Culture Research Observatory that will be independent of particular funding streams. But this becomes quite kind of individual driven. So a big thinking for you is, how do you protect the data sets? Where do you keep them so that they can be revisited over time, regardless of where the funding streams come from? And a growing new challenge and issue is ethics. How do you deal with any materials that are the result of interviews and connections with people, with focus group, with consultations? How do we set up arguments to explain how important it is to be able to revisit this rather than delete it? It's a very, very important conversation that has not been resolved yet. And obviously the other big challenge has to do with the collaborative approach. It's extremely time consuming, and the most important piece of advice that I can provide there is that it requires a particular role description, and it's the role of the mediator, the bridge builder. Any team that wants to deliver an effective and a realistic, holistic research framework needs to have individuals that can spend time just connecting and liaising in between the different points of pressure, the different disciplines, the different interests. It cannot be taken for granted. It's very exhausting, but it's very rewarding if done well. And yes, you have been mentioning again the importance of different styles of communication, of having your technical reports, of having your summaries, of having a bit of fun in sharing things through social media, but also being very rigorous and having other pieces that can be quite critical and used responsibly so that the context can be understood. So again, in terms of lessons, and I'm sorry in the end I've taken far too long, is that continued point of the many forms that impact takes and how to balance it. So yes, I agree with you. Let's confront the extreme pressure towards the economic, but let's make sure that the economic doesn't disappear. So let's give more space to the cultural and social angles, and also think environmental and political and other keywords, and understand that this has to be revisited regularly. Over time and process are the other keywords. And maybe another piece of key advice for you here, especially as we keep now with the impact of COVID, no? How do we work? How do we conduct research if we cannot travel in the same way, if we cannot get close to people in the same way? It all forces us to try to become more and more pragmatic and to keep narrowing down or being scaling down approaches. I would say loud and clear, regardless of the amount of expertise that exists out there and your awareness of models, there is a point when it's just not possible to deliver a holistic impact assessment. If the budget is too small, if the time is too narrow, if the pressure is just about immediacy, it's just not possible. So be there, confront that, and there in some cases be insistent on where it is more advisable to slow down certain processes in order to end up with pieces of research that are meaningful and avoid the risk of inflating claims and delivering or creating untenable expectations for evaluation. Because the big risk over the last 10 years, and I think as a result of Impacts 08 in part, at least in the UK, is that there has been this rush towards the biggest claim. No, I mean, how much more can we say? And that is just not helpful. It ends up becoming difficult to believe some of the evidence claims that are presented out there. So I will leave it there. There is a lot of material online. So, and it's not just the summary reports. There is a lot of appendices and a lot of technical documentation. I have to say, sometimes it's difficult to find it. So for instance, with the European Parliament report, it's quite hard to find the appendices. But I'm trying my best And especially through the Cities of Culture Research Observatory, I will be putting more and more information so that there is at least a hub. And what I would hope is that with yourselves and the work of SoPHIA, you also get this kind of common platform.